Welcome to the Security Insider podcast series, brought to you by the Australian Security Industry Association Limited, the peak body for security professionals in Australia.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Security Insider podcast. And today we are discussing the ins and outs of selling your business. And to help us navigate this somewhat tricky subject, we're joined by Michael John of Aquila Corporate Business Advisory and Mark Jason of Link Business and Peter Johnson of ASIAL. Gentlemen, thank you very much. And thank you for joining us on the Security Insider podcast. So today we are talking about selling your business. And Mike, I just want to get you to start off by telling us a little bit about your background to add some credibility and tell us a little bit about what you do. And then Mark, you can jump in to you.
Sure. My name's Michael Johns. I'm a director of a company called Aquila Corporate Advisory. We do mergers and acquisitions advisory. I've got a background in corporate banking and have been advising private family businesses now for over 15 years.
Excellent. Mark, tell us a little bit about your background.
Mark Jason from Link Business. I've been transacting businesses for over 20 years. Link has offices across Australia and New Zealand, transacts about 1,400 businesses a year.
And Peter, if people don't know who you are by now, they're probably living under a rock, but go on, give us the background spiel anyway.
Yeah, Peter Johnson. I'm from ASIAL and I'm the Compliance and Regulatory Affairs Advisor for our members in ASIAL.
Excellent. Now, as I mentioned today, we're talking about selling a business, and there is probably a range of topics that we're going to cover over the course of this conversation. But I guess the place that I want to start is, how do I know if my business is actually worth anything to anyone other than me? Because I'm given to understand that there's a wide range of businesses out there, from accountants to law firms and everything in between, where it's a great business for that individual. It provides them with a wage, but just because it's a great business for them doesn't mean it's actually worth anything to their competitors. So how do I determine whether or not my business is actually worth anything to anyone except me? And perhaps, Mike, if you can kick us off.
It's a good question. And I guess it also, you can ask that question across any industry. And I think what becomes important is understanding that every business is different and every person that owns and operates a business is different. So you really have to look at every individual circumstance on its merits. And I guess the process of going through an analysis of why to sell your business and how it's going to work involves an understanding of value. And often it's not until you actually start that process and understand what drives value that you it soon becomes apparent in terms of who it would be appealing to and why. And also you identify characteristics of a business that maybe make it less appealing. But that in itself creates opportunities to try and focus on areas where value can be dug up by working on the business.
Yep. And so, Mark, if we sort of throw it over to you, when we're looking at how do I determine if my business is worth anything to anyone but me, are there common elements in your experience that tend to make a business worth something beyond simply providing the owner with a job?
Great question. Look, businesses all have an intrinsic value, and most businesses will sell. It just depends on what that value is. As a valuer, we look at a business, we look at the value drivers associated with the business, depth of management, owner involvement, systems and processes, customer spread, so on and so forth. And from that, we're able to really identify where the value of the business sits. And what's amazing to me is that it's not very common that the business owner has a good idea of what his business is worth. A lot of clients that I come into contact with find that they believe that their business is worth more, and then there's many clients that don't realise the true value of their business. I've got one at the moment who was actually closing his doors, and we're receiving offers around the 3 million mark at the moment for a business he thought he was just going to shut the doors on.
Right, because I guess there's always that challenge of trying to define, have I bought myself a job or have I actually started a business? And you spoke a little bit about the value drivers behind the business, but we can come back and have a look at that in a second. I guess what are the most common reasons people look to sell a business? Under what circumstances might they want to sell a business? And Mark, maybe we'll stick with you and you can kick us off, and then we'll come to you, Mike.
Under what circumstances? Look, it's the circumstances of when they want to sell. It's way better to sell a business when you don't have to sell a business. Yeah. And I think we find a lot of people that we're seeing in the market now are at retirement age, and they're in a need to sell basis, whether it's due to ill health or other circumstances. And if you want to realize the best value in your business, you really want to get the business to market when you're prepared and you don't have to sell, because that pulling driver will affect the value of the business. Do you agree, Mike?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We often talk about the why, and Mark and I have got many stories to tell about people that sell businesses because they are forced to because of circumstance, which is unfortunate. So often it's a health issue, a divorce, a death, something like that, and even just a lack of succession in a family business where the younger generation either don't want to or can't hold the responsibility of taking on the burden of running a private family business.
Yeah, and I guess for a lot of people, they sort of, and I'm assuming a lot here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of people sort of tend to, especially business owners, tend to kind of view their business as their super. It's like, I'll sell my business when I go to retire and that will fund my retirement. But it's not always necessarily a gimme that your business is going to be, as you pointed out before, Mark, that your business is going to be worth what you think it may be. So when it's time to start investigating whether or not you actually want to sell your business and whether or not your business is sellable, when's the best time to start that? Is it 10 years before you're thinking about selling? Is it 5 years? Is it a month and a half? Mike, perhaps you can kick us off.
Well, I think if you've got the time and you can plan strategically in terms of creating an exit plan, then I would have thought, at least 12 months will give you enough time to be able to work on the business, to have a clear strategy to exit. Obviously, some people don't have that luxury, so they get forced into a shorter time span of working on the process to sell. But like anything, the more time you have to prepare, the better. I think some people that run businesses are even more adept, I guess, of working out what market they operate in, and they can see the end game in advance. So they'll prepare their business exit with a view to targeting a specific type of buyer, for example, a private equity firm, for example. So they would undertake a very staged and methodical process to build value in their business over a 1 or 2 year period. But again, it's horses for courses. Some people are almost in a state of readiness to prepare a business for sale, whereas others, whilst on the outside they might look like they've got a great business, but internally they might need work done on processes and preparing documentation and information.
Well, Peter, that's probably a great place to bring you in here, because a lot of businesses, I'm assuming, are going to need certain policies, procedures, frameworks, and all the sorts of things like SOPs in place to actually help sell the business and get a decent valuation. And I assume it's not always such a quick turnaround to get all of this stuff in place and get it sorted out.
No, you're quite right. It's the biggest problem we have with people purchasing businesses that the seller sometimes doesn't grasp the fact that the purchaser will, if they're doing their job properly, do an appropriate due diligence. And that due diligence process is one that the seller on many occasions, not necessarily, it depends on the size of the business, of course. And we've got a lot of mid-sized, small companies in the security industry in Australia, but they don't understand what due diligence wants. And they want to see all the documentation. They want to see the processes, the procedures. They want to see the contracts that may or may not exist. And that then starts the value as to what we can actually value the business at. And a lot of times when we are moving through that process to sell the business, it's been a period of time where they may have had a signed contract and the client continues for many years and there's no signed contracts. So therefore, what is the value? What is going to hold the client to that business? And then naturally, and we'll talk about it down the track, I guess, is the what are we buying? Are we buying the business or are we buying the entity? And that has many other challenges. So getting the documentation right to enable due diligence to take place is a challenge in most of the small companies anyway.
Yeah, because I imagine there can be changes that come about through the course of doing business, changes in legislation where a business is not necessarily doing the wrong thing. They've just continued to do what they've been doing prior to a legislation change over the course of the years. And we'll take casual employees as an example, where there might be a change in legislation around how we treat casual employees, requiring that we have to put those people on a contract that states certain things. And I've had casual employees forever and a day. I maybe haven't moved on as quickly with that legislative requirement as I should have. Someone comes in to look at the sale of the business and goes, hang on, you need to go back and have all your staff redo new working contracts under these casual arrangements. You have to have discussions with them around what their wishes are and then get all the paperwork signed. I imagine that's not going to be a quick process.
No, it's not. And that's coming down to the employees. What are you buying? Buying the business or are you buying the entity? And the thing being is that's an industrial relations challenge as to what status the employees are. Are you buying the entity? What is your responsibility for these ongoing employees? Are they going to be terminated? What is the cost? And who's going to pick up that cost? And if it's the value of the business, it's going to diminish the value of that business when those costs are recognised. And so the seller will say, well, I've got a great business, but I just forgot that I actually owe many, many employees long service leave. I haven't paid certain entitlements. I now need to clean that up in the due diligence process. And that becomes a challenge for the organisations in selling it. And again, what are you selling, the entity or the business? And then the valuations are really a challenge.
Some of those challenges can determine the structure that you'll need to sell it in if they haven't taken care of things like long service leave or casual staff and the changes in legislation. And then that'll determine that it needs to be a trade sale to someone that has a license that they can effectively shift the operations to a new entity as opposed to keeping them within the current entity that has the licensing as well. It's important to note though that, a sale doesn't necessarily have to be 100% sale, and that reasons aren't always that they have to get out or they want to retire or anything like that. I mean, quite often we're dealing with buyers that are looking to exit some of the business for strategic reasons, whether that's opening up new territories or opening up, exposing themselves to new equity that allows them to continue the growth trajectory that the business is on. You talked previously about private equity firms that are sort of opening the door to better management skills, better connections, or just growth equity as well. So there's all these other reasons. I mean, I often sell businesses where my client, and I'm talking about different industries here, but my client wants to open up into North America. So he's only after a minority buyer who has access into North America. So, it's about uncovering the reasonings why our clients want to look at a transaction, what the ideal transaction looks like, and then finding buyers that match that criteria and qualifying them before they ever even find out the name of the business as well, because there's no point going down that path if they're not aligned in strategy.
Look, that's a good segue into talking a little bit more about potential customers and who might be the kinds of customers that we're looking to have buy the business, because it's not necessarily going to be someone who just simply wants to buy a business. It might be, as you've alluded to, shareholders in another business that want to move into a different state or territory. It might be, Peter, as you mentioned, people looking to buy an entity. Can you walk me through, Mark, some of the kinds of targets that would potentially be identified as future customers for buying the business, and how I might go about finding those potential customers?
Yeah, look, every business that we take on, we look at where the business might be strategically aligned to a purchaser. So you've got your horizontal access, so that might be a direct competitor, but then sometimes our clients are a bit apprehensive about going to direct competitors if they're in a a tendering market and so on, it may affect the business. So we need to obviously, mark those as a no-go zone. And then we're looking for people doing what they're doing in another location that want to expand geographically, and approaching those on a confidential no-names basis. And we're also looking for synergistic businesses in the same locality. So, for example, in this area, if you're doing monitoring and someone's got a lot of guard type sort of security businesses, they want to look at more of a recurring revenue, then we'll go to those companies that aren't direct competitors but would see synergies in buying your business and adding it onto their operations.
Yeah. So, for example, if I were a company that specialized in installing telecommunications infrastructure and I saw a security installation and integration business for sale, and I thought, hey, we've got the people, we've got the tools, we've got the resources, we can just roll straight into that sector.
Exactly.
Sorry, Mike, you were going to say?
No, I'm agreeing with you in the sense that it's finding those complementary aspects where people can get synergies.
Now, Peter, a question for you. It seems that sometimes in this industry especially, we hear about people being made offers that seem too good to be true when people are wanting to buy a security business. And we have to start wondering, well, what is it that they're actually wanting here? Do they want my EBA? Do they want my security license? And because we are a naturally suspicious lot, we're cautious. And, if the offer appears to be too good to be true, then we think, oh, maybe they're just trying to buy the business because of the EBL. Maybe they're just trying to buy the business because of the license. Do I care? I mean, does it matter why they're buying the business? Money's money, isn't it?
Yeah, these are the challenges we see where some organisations, and we saw before with Mike saying that what is the exit strategy? And sometimes organisations also see that what is our risk, and do we need other entities to actually support us in a complementary manner? So some organisations will buy an entity that holds the licenses because they need a new entity, and if they are not a security licensed entity already, they will take time to get licenses, and the jurisdictions in which they operate, they will need licenses in each of those jurisdictions as well. So if you want to start in security, you need to actually purchase an organisation as an entity that holds the licenses you want. And that will means that once you have that transaction completed, you will be able to work straight away and bring that organisation complementary into your offerings that you may have in your existing business. But remember that if it's a security activity, you need a security license. So sometimes organisations buy an entity and then try to run it under the existing group entity. That may work in the area of taxation, where you see the ATO allowing group companies. But in the security licensing, it's all about the ACN, ABN. It can't be a group company with a separate ABN, ACN. So therefore, we have that area where some lawyers and accountants will give you great advice, but they're not quite on point on the security licensing area. So that's the area we see as a challenge, where organisations say, I want to buy this company, but in actual fact, they don't understand the licensing. And when you do buy or change the directors of a company, you've then got to have a new ASIC document in relation to the new directors. The new directors are required to go through what is fingerprinting, probity. They're all the close associates, and the regulator must be advised within a period of time, varying from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but normally within a couple of weeks, they've got to advise the regulator of the change of directors. You may not even have your probity and fingerprints completed in that time. So there's a lot of challenges in that area that's not quite part of the normal purchase and sale of a business with normal licensing, because security licensing has its own jurisdictional peculiarities.
I guess one of the things I wanted to touch on, though, is sometimes people go, oh, be careful, they just want to buy your EBA, or they just want to buy your license or whatever. Do I care? I mean, money's money, isn't it?
EBAs in particular in Victoria, I've sold a number of labour hire businesses where that's been, a pivotal point of the business, and part of the ability to generate the profits that they are generating. And so being able to buy an EBA and then transact, like you said, through that company with the other operations that the business was previously conducting was a really important synergistic note for the acquirer in that situation.
And EBAs, is it transferable?
Yeah.
And the question being is that it's generally lower associated with the entity, and therefore you may buy a business and think you can run your whole business under that EBA, and that's where industrial relations advice, very, very important in regard to that.
So, Mark, what are some of the more common mistakes that you see people make when they're trying to sell a business?
Well, John, I think, as I said previously, selling when you have to is a massive mistake that I find a lot of people make. You really do end up leaving money on the table if you have to exit the business quickly and you can't be there to do a good handover or to help grow the business or achieve certain goals with the new owners. I'm happy to share this point with you, but we've both got many reasons.
Yeah. Look, I think preparation's the key. So the more you're prepared, the better the outcome, I would say, because it helps you not only with the process itself, but if you have a good process, generally you'll get better engagement with potential buyers, and better engagement generally leads to better outcomes from a value perspective and structuring, and then better outcomes lead to better completion processes, and better completion processes makes it,
it's a
good for everyone.
Point. I mean, even just from a buyer's point of view, if you're not prepared properly with the right information, you find a lot of buyers think that you might be hiding something along the way. So having your ducks lined up, but also not necessarily giving all the information. I mean, in security particularly, customer names and that sort of thing, when you're selling to a trade buyer, it's really important to keep that information, hidden to the right point. So, I see a lot of people in the transaction process, and I see a lot of my contemporaries really allowing buyers in when they shouldn't be allowing them in, before they're making sure that, the right documentation's in place, making sure that the right checks and balances are there, making sure that the offer's on the same page, really. Don't you agree, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, buyer vetting is important to make sure that, your ideal buyer has got money. So if you can ascertain that a potential buyer candidate has got the capacity to pay, somehow you can verify that. And also that they've even had previous experience in transacting, because often if it's their first acquisition, it's often you're bearing some of that risk yourself as a seller.
Well, I guess there's a follow-on question that I'd like to ask, that because if I'm running off on a red herring here, just tell me. But I would imagine that there are going to be instances where people approach you with an offer to buy just because they want to have a look inside the bag and see what's in there. And so how do we go through that buyer vetting and make sure that we're not just giving competitors a free look at our books?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting because, a lot of times I've been told by people, someone's approached me to offer to buy my business, and that makes them feel good. It's a great tactic from the buyer's perspective, because they're effectively trying to get front running on something outside of a process. Yeah. And the sellers think it's fantastic because they feel loved, and it validates their own view of their business. But what it does is it disrupts what would normally happen in a contested process. So I think competitive tension. So, and it disjoints the preparation process as well too. So I always tell people, well, that's great, it's flattering, and I would have expected that you'd been approached by someone to buy your business, because if you hadn't been approached, probably your competitor has been. I guess it solidifies the approach of having a formal process and engaging with the market in a prepared state, so that when you do go looking on a proactive basis rather than a reactive basis, you'll probably more likely get a better outcome.
That's a really good point, Michael, because I tell you, I get clients all the time that are already dealing with someone, and they might be the best buyer, but without running a proper process, you can't create that competitive tension, and you can't get the best results. And, often I'm finding that those buyers that are going out to the market themselves are canvassing hundreds of businesses and they're looking for the cheapest and best option. And I've had other instances where a client of mine's been approached by a public company and we've identified that that public company is the best, most synergistic buyer, but we're not running a competitive tender. And so we've taken it off the market. We've got the business prepared properly. We've gone out to a longer list of potential buyers and brought them onto the table with offerings. And then we've brought that synergistic buyer in a bit late. And what that's done is push them to work quicker, at a higher price and on the terms that we wanted. And we uplifted their offer from that took 18 months to achieve. We uplifted that by 33%, which was a 20% uplift on the other buyers. And that's what you're able to achieve if you've got the right structure and you're prepared properly.
Yep.
That all comes down to receiving, looking for the advice you really need. Don't think you know everything. And that's where you need to go out into the appropriate market to actually seek that direction. Because then, as you say, someone can assist you significantly. It may cost something, but the benefits actually outweigh any costs associated.
I wouldn't be in a job if there wasn't benefits to it. One other point that I would love to make, just on the prep to market, I think what I'm finding is sometimes people just don't get the right tax advice. And we talked previously about this being their nest egg or their super, and it's so important to get that tax advice because at times it can save millions of dollars if you get the right advice. And that advice can also affect the structure of a deal or your ongoing relationship with the business, depending on what sort of advice you've got about rolling money into super and so on and so forth.
Yep.
Yeah. And that may be a condition precedent on the sale that certain things have to be met in relation before the sale can go through. And that may be the clearing of debts if you're buying the entity, and it may be the finance structure or the licensing exchange, or some of the bigger companies, it may be the ability to actually have the company sold, and that may be an ACCC thing. We see that with the larger organisations, that they actually need approval to actually purchase, not the smaller ones where a lot of our members in the security industry are small to medium-sized companies, so they don't see that part of it, and they just want to see that the money in the bank when they sell a business. But there can be a lot of conditions precedents to actually do that, and there might be warranties and guarantees. And that's the problem they have with small companies. They may have to stay with the organisation for a period of time, and then if the profit is not there, they may find that a percentage of the sale price is withheld until a period of time so they can determine that the business is an ongoing success. So they're the problems we have.
But there's an important point there, I guess, though. You talk about how not necessarily with some of the smaller businesses, but especially in this space, being the security space, there are a lot of smaller companies that operate in very specialised and secure areas that have access to sensitive sites or information or whatever it may be. And it could be in cybersecurity, it could be in critical infrastructure maintenance and support, it could be in a range of areas. Would those transactions need to be looked at under foreign ownership and investment? And then do they have to be approved by certain bodies before that sale can go ahead? Is that the case?
Yeah, I guess not so much in the security industry generally, but where any organisation that is appropriately licensed, another organisation can purchase that organisation. It's not as though there's barriers to purchase, except when you get to the larger organisations. Then you get to the ownership, the international ownership. Some organisations may have overseas government part ownership, and they become then to the attention of the government, and the government may then interfere and say that we will not approve the purchase of that. But that's not your general run-of-the-mill small organisation. Okay. Certainly your larger organisations, it's a consideration that Mike and Mark would come in touch with.
Peter, you made a really good point before, and you talked about clearing up debts and the balance sheet. And Mike, how many times have we come across someone who's got share portfolios and companies and all sorts of other assets in their balance sheet?
Let alone the P&L.
Oh, look, I'm not so concerned about normalising accounts because everyone has non-essential business expenses in their P&L, and I've seen all sorts of stuff in my time, and I won't go into it on air, but just on the balance sheet, because we were talking about the sale of potentially a company. Yeah,
no, definitely. So there's a process to go through, obviously, and explain to the vendors as well too, in terms of how that tidy up is going to work, because essentially there'll be a collection of either excluded assets or liabilities that need to be transferred out or neutralised.
And I imagine, and we'll come to this later in the podcast, but I imagine there's an element too of, you've sold your business, fantastic, you've been given a lump sum of cash, don't go charging off and buying expensive watches and sports cars just yet, because we don't know what's going to happen in the next 6 months. Is someone going to come back and say, well, in light of what's happened, now there's a situation where someone was underpaid on this occasion, or, something happened over here. Can these sorts of things rear their head and sort of be financial imposts upon your sale further down the track?
Well, you definitely don't buy a boat before you're settled. The warranty environment in the sale documentation is something that essentially has to be negotiated. For the larger businesses, you can get insurance to cover it, but it comes at a cost, and the insurers have limits in terms of the sort of size of businesses, the minimum size.
I think stuff like what you were talking about pay rates and that, I really think that should be on the purchaser to do their due diligence on. And I think if you've got a good representative, they'll bark in your corner to make sure that that's not part of your warranties and conditions, because it's up to the purchaser to uncover that in that sale process. And
that's why due diligence is so important, and that's to seek and get the right advice. But that's why lawyers and accountants would advise someone initially, buy the business, not the entity, because you're not buying, if you buy the entity, you're buying all the outstanding debts that you've got to the organisation that you may or may not recognise in your due diligence. And as you said, John, may come up and bite you down the track, that there's been a legal case where next minute you're required to actually pay entitlements that were for those employees. So that's why it's very important. But unfortunately, in the security industry, if you don't buy the entity, you don't keep the licence. You buy the business, you hopefully have a license so you can run the business into your existing business. So they're the things that people, and we find that a lot where people have bought a business and then they realise that they haven't bought the entity and they need a security license. And next minute it might take 6 to 12 weeks to get that license.
Well, there's that, whether they need the license, and certainly a trade buyer, there's mutual recognition between states and whatnot, and it can be a process, like you said, 6 to 12 weeks to attain the license. Some of those are easy hurdles to overcome if we're organised properly. And I think, it goes to getting the right advice, making sure we're prepared properly, and getting the tax advice as well, because it can be more expensive sometimes depending on the structure that you transact the business. So when you go to market, not only do you want to know exactly what your owner wants as your client wants as an outcome, but also what structures are necessary, whether it's licensing requirements, whether contracts can be transferred and signed. There's all of those things, right, Mike?
Yeah, because even like selling an entity, can be easier. Because if you've got a company that's got a whole lot of contracts and you want to sell the business, then all of those contracts have to get assigned or re-entered into. So either way, sometimes depending on the nature of the business, there's things to consider in terms of the strategy of going forward.
And the entity is very important on that licensing, as you said, because mutual recognition does not apply to businesses. It only applies in the security industry to individuals. And so that the business is required to obtain each license in each jurisdiction. So if you're an organisation that works nationally and you're buying a business that is in a certain jurisdiction, like Victoria or New South Wales or Queensland, you'll turn around and buy that business, but you won't be able to operate that business cross-border without those other jurisdictional licenses. So they're the things that sometimes people don't understand, that it's such a jurisdictional challenge that we have in the security industry, and there's slight variations in each jurisdiction. And we even from the licensing, like Queensland, it's a firm license. New South Wales, master license. ACT, master license. Victorian, a license or a registration. Agent's license in Tasmania, South Australia, Western Australia, and a firm license in the Northern Territory. Nothing's even called the same. So it's a challenge for people just to grasp all of that as well.
As long as we've got as long as we're organised before we go to market, I think, and we know who the buyer is, when we're doing a term sheet, you can delay settlement for that if necessary. And again, it depends on tax advice, it depends on novating contracts, it depends on all of those other matters, whether you've got other assets in your entity and what the implications are to each of those. You've got to weigh that up, and then sometimes it's just a delayed settlement if necessary.
And the delayed settlement recently, an example was that an organisation that was licensed in every jurisdiction was selling part of their business, and they put part of that business into another entity that they had, but that entity did not hold licenses. So when it come to the settlement, that was only a matter of 6 weeks away, they realised that they still hadn't had new licenses for that entity. And one of those processes took 12 weeks. So we have a delay in settlement because we just don't do that original due diligence, the transfer of licenses, the responsibilities. But not only security licenses in our industry, we're challenged by labour hire licensing as well in a couple of jurisdictions. And now we're going to have a look at, from a challenge in the future, hopefully we'll get not hopefully, but it appears that we will get a national labour hire licence process. Now, that may actually simplify things, but at the moment, there's a labour hire licence in Queensland, Victoria and South Australia. The thing being is, you have to get a licence in each of those jurisdictions except South Australia, because we managed to get an exemption for security licensed companies. But if we get a national one, we may actually have that if you hold a labour hire licence in one jurisdiction, it may actually qualify you in another jurisdiction. So it may simplify things, but you've got to know this beforehand. And that's where we come back to obtain that good advice, pay for that good advice, and actually act on that good advice, because unfortunately a lot of people take the advice but then think they can do better, and that's the challenge. They just don't do their due diligence and just don't understand the responsibilities of those warranties, indemnities and what have you that we have, and we see it's a bit of a mess at the end, and that's why you need advice.
So when it comes to selling an organisation, I imagine that there are a multitude of ways that you can value your business to determine how you're going to sell it. So this is, we'll take this as a two-part question, and we'll start with you, Mike. First of all, what makes a business valuable? And then secondly, when we're looking at selling it, how do we determine the best way to value it?
I think the simplest way to value businesses is basically a multiple of its earnings. So it's basically trying to determine what's the maintainable profit of a business, and then applying a multiple to that, and that gives you what's called an enterprise value. And then from an enterprise value, you can take out any debt that's in the business, as an example. That'll give you like an equity value, the owner's value. If you look at it a different way, if you look at a house that's worth $1 million and it's got a $500,000 mortgage on it, the equity value is $500,000. So an enterprise value of the house is $1 million. The equity value is $500,000. A business is very similar. Typically, to keep it simple, bigger businesses often command a higher multiple, and higher multiples also apply to businesses that have higher strategic value or growth prospects. So depending on the business itself, the value is going to be derived from a number of those factors: how big it is, what's its growth prospects, and how strategic it is to the potential buyer. So that the process of then determining the actual value of the business is then determined by analysing, obviously, its historical financial information and its prospects going forward, including like budgets, and then undertaking a process of normalising the profit and loss to try and determine what is the true maintainable earnings.
Okay, but what about situations, Mark, where I might have a unique IP or systems and procedures that I've developed that are worth something to other organisations? Do those things get valued differently if we're trying to figure out what a business is actually worth, or is it still part of that same process?
Look, valuation is a subjective thing. I've been valuing businesses for 15 years, and you can use a number of different methodologies to value a business, but just like with houses, I think comparable sales is a very good place to start because it's hard facts in essence. You really need to look at 15 to 20 value drivers that will affect the business. Obviously, historic earnings is a great starting point, and how consistent those earnings are, what the trends are in those earnings, and then you start going into operational value drivers, and it's all about the risk profile. You guys would know as security experts, you're always assessing risk, and a buyer or a valuer will be assessing the risk around the different operational nuances of your business. So you know how long those customers have been with you. How exposed you are to your number one customer, what the spread of your customers are. Are they concentrated in one industry or one geographic area, or are they widespread? And the owner involvement, the systems and processes, and how long the business has been established, and what positive trend lines it's got, and all of these things can come into effect. Michael, you talked about strategic value earlier, and it's very hard to identify what the strategic value is until you're looking at the buyer. And sometimes the buyer will be holding those cards quite close. So it can take a little bit of research to sort of really dig into that strategic value and see whether there's some money to be saved in this particular back office function, or in these software, or in other areas that are expenses to the business that are cutting into that profit. And if they can save that money on your business, or if they can cross-pollinate their services or their products with your customer base, and your products and services with their customer base, then that's exponentially increasing the profitability of both businesses. It creates a more intrinsic value for that acquirer. And that's what we talk about when we talk about uncovering that strategic value.
Yeah, I think if you think of it in the sense of a business having an average value, like a mean type value, and then everything above it is a premium based on some of those areas that Mark talked about. So average value is X. How do I get more than X? I get more than X because I've got diverse customers. They're all on 20-year contracts. They're all government, all these sorts of things. So they're adding to your X factor all the time.
Tier one clients.
Recurring
revenue.
Under management. So I'm an owner, but I'm not actually in the business. And then negative X is obviously all the things, the opposite of that. So I've got 3 clients, one's on a contract, all the others aren't, things like that. But you can only discover that once you're in the business and you can see it, and then you're trying to look through the eyes of a buyer to establish what those strategic value X drivers are going to be. The other thing to be mindful of as well is that no one wants to pay more than they have to. So even though you might identify all these X plus factors that add incrementally to the strategic value notionally of the business, the challenge is then to deliver those for the seller, because the buyer, they might have already identified these X plus factors, but they don't necessarily want to pay for it.
Yeah.
And then that leads you into the process.
To give a simple mathematical idea on this, or example, I had 2 businesses in the registered training organisation, typically selling at 4 times. One of those business sold for 2.9 times, and the other one sold for 8.3 times next year's earnings. So one was all online, a lot of blue sky. It was doing site white tickets and RSAs. It was all online. It was cash flow positive. It was growing at 30% per annum. There were no classrooms, no teachers, so on and so forth. The other one was doing the tickets for forklifts. It was heavy machinery. There was OH&S. It was a declining industry. Sales were declining. The owner was doing the training hands-on. And so that gives you guys out there a practical example of the differences between the value drivers in the same overall industry.
And that's really a prime example is what buyers are out there. And one example is that a company that would be turning over $20,000 in the last 12 months really wasn't operating, but had licenses in Victoria and New South Wales. Really, if you bought it, you wouldn't pay more than 20 grand because it had license. It would cost you that to get the license. A company purchased that for quite a few $100,000 because they wanted it. It was a clean company. It provided a risk management for them. It enabled them to expand immediately into another area. So you come back to valuations. It really is what buyers are out there and what do they really want and what are they willing to pay. But you've really got to demonstrate that you've got what they want. And that's the having all your ducks in a row, having that documentation that you really need, making sure that your financials are actually understandable, that you haven't hidden all those things that you've had in your small business, that you've put all your costs that we see organisations do, but try to, save money along the way, but then trying to demonstrate that through clean accounting records, it's not always possible. So they're the challenges, but it's what the buyer would like to pay.
You're so right. I mean, there certainly are assets like that have an intrinsic value that needs to be uncovered and recognised. 100% correct.
And I think I was just going to say, in trying to establish these synergistic X factors, as I like to call them, sometimes for the seller, they're not as overtly aware of what they might be. Yep. And that's why I think once you sit down with a vendor and talk about their business and understand it a bit more and where they sit in the industry, you can start to flesh out with them what these factors actually might be, because sometimes they're not as aware of what drives a buyer and what they might have that is actually valuable that they might not have thought was as valuable in the context of the entire business.
Well, let's stick with that because it's a good segue to the next point. What is the formal process? If you can give us a snapshot of the formal process, when we're looking at selling a business, what can we expect to go through?
I like to start off with a valuation. For me, I want to give something to my client, which is my expert, honest opinion of 20 years, and from my database of 7,000 transactions, and this is what your business is worth. Because at the end of the day, I back myself to get a result, and if we're not on the same page, then it's going to be a waste of my time and your time if I'm not going to be able to realize your value, but also if I'm not going to get paid at the end of the day as well. So I like to start off with a valuation.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point because setting everyone's expectations at the front end is really important so that everyone knows exactly what's likely to happen in terms of the value equation, because ultimately that's what the sellers are trying to achieve. It's a monetary value for an asset.
Well, just because I think my business is worth $5 million and you're like, well, actually it's only worth plant and equipment and that's it.
Yeah. And there's plenty of stories where, the seller says, oh, Billy, my mate, got 8 times for his business. And you say, well, 8 times what? And they look at the sky and they're not sure.
The two businesses aren't the same.
They're never the
value
same.
Drivers in those businesses could be very different as well, right?
So establishing some sort of value range at the outset, I think is really important in terms of the process, because effectively you're beginning with the end in mind. And then I guess, Mark probably follows a similar sort of process in terms of preparation of an information memorandum type document that's going to be used to be distributed on a confidential basis to prospective buyers. But you want to add something?
I was just going to say, the beautiful thing with valuation is that, even if the price is not right, it really helps you identify where there's maybe some weaknesses in your business that you can actually work on over the next period of time if you've got time. And that goes back to preparation. If you've got tax advice and you know what you need to retire on and you have a valuation for your business and your business is short, then you have a gap analysis and you can put together a plan or a roadmap of how to get to where you need to get to retire at the level of comfort that you want to retire at. But you don't know unless you've done both of those processes and understood both your own personal sort of journey post business and where your business is at today.
Yeah, and it also might help in framing what sort of deal you're going to be prepared to do, because you might be happy if you owe the bank $5 million and someone comes in and says, well, your business is worth $5 million, you're going to go, right, okay, so I'm just getting out with nothing. But if you don't owe the bank any money, you might be prepared to do a deal with someone where they give you, 60% up front and 40% in 12 months' time.
And those earn-out processes can be common because if you don't know all the things, earn-out processes may be something that would encourage the person to buy for that higher price because they know they're going to have those earn-out processes whereby you're going to be part of their business or you're not going to get final payments until you recognise that the revenue stream is consistent, the clients will stay, they're happy with that. So those earn-out arrangements on a sale can actually benefit both parties. It means the buyer might be happy to pay that little bit extra because they're going to get demonstration over a period of time of earnouts, and so payment over a period of time.
Great point, Peter. I think certainly an earnout is one of the structural mechanisms that we can use to increase the value of the business. If you don't mind, we can go through what the other structural options are, and we can also go through some pitfalls and things to look out for with earnouts as well. I'm happy to talk about both of those. A lot of buyers want an earnout on the net profit, but you don't necessarily have control over that once you've sold the business. So, for me, I call it a managed earnout. I only like to do earnouts when the owner is still in the business. And typically, the most fairest marker for a target on an earnout would be the gross profit margin, because that's still keeping a profit in the contracts that you win or that you retain. It's not giving them away for nothing, and it's what someone managing the business, i.e. an ex-owner, still has the most control over. And then, you need to have some safety nets there for your vendor, and a good broker will ensure that the vendor, there's guarantees in place that the vendor's going to get paid and that he has vision over the financials, and that, there's not adjustments made to them, and that there is perhaps some asset that we can take a lien over that has equity in it on that earnout.
I agree, because if you can't control the expenses that go in the profit and loss line, then
easily disappears.
Profit can go to zero pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So that the agreement of earnouts can actually be diminished very quickly depending on that process. And that's where organisations need to understand what they're doing, whether it's retention of clients, things that are measurable. Because as you say, you can put a lot of things in the P&L that would enable the buyer to say, well, there's no value in that earnout and we're not paying you. But if you've got earnout agreements in relation to retention of clients, yes, the bottom line profit in relation to the value of each client, it's their measurable things. And that's what we see people fail, is because in these earnout processes, they agree to it, but it's not measurable.
That's correct. And so it doesn't have to be on gross profit. It could be on a clawback of clients signed over and so on and so forth. The other thing I'd point out there is that, everyone has their own risk profile. Some people go, oh, I don't like the sound of that, I heard that Joe didn't get his money or whatever. And I think that certainly has been the case with some advisors that aren't protecting their clients' best interests. And it certainly has been the case when you didn't have PPSR registers, against real property and the like, where you could take a lien over that, and you're essentially signing a document that is akin to a bank loan in some respects. And so that there's some great points to be made there. What about some other sort of mechanisms we could use or structures to really increase the value of a business in a sale process?
Well, I think there's deferral of the purchase price, so it's not contingent.
Yes.
And on the earn out, there's obviously upside earn outs as well too. So
Correct.
If depending on again the seller's profile and their risk profile and how integral they see themselves in the period following the sale, they might back themselves and actually say, well, you know what, I can
100%.
I reckon I can back myself to, bank some growth and I want a share of that.
So I've seen people that my risk profile is around 30%, over 1 to 2 years. I've seen people that are on high growth businesses that are happy to leave 80% on the table over 5 years, and instead of getting 5 times what their business is worth, they get 20 times. But that's a different beast, and everyone has their own risk profile. And so some great points to be made there as well.
Yeah. And it depends on the buyer as well too, because some of them probably be a bit more narrow focused and they just want to transact and take it in, integrate it and get on with business.
True. And if it's a merger, it's a lot harder to sort of, identify what the continued, performance
who contributed
of the business.
to what.
Exactly. And you talked about deferred payments there as another mechanism and structure, and I guess another word for that is vendor finance. So again, there's a lot more, structure to a vendor finance than there was back in the day. It's not like you take over the business anymore. You can take over some real property, and you are really signing a loan document. And what that does is it's basically releasing equity in assets that people don't have access to. At the moment, banks are typically lending about 50 or 60% to buy a business. And sometimes when that particular buyer doesn't have the money to complete a sale at the price you want, providing a little bit of vendor finance does open up the buyer pool. And as we all know, supply and demand increases by increasing the number of buyers will increase the value of the business as well. And it sort of changes the dynamic of the actual conversation. Instead of, will you buy this business and will you pay what we want, to, are you good enough for us to lend you the money?
Yeah. So for those people who don't understand, explain a little bit about what vendor finance is and how it works.
You're essentially the bank. The bank will release 50 or 60% based on your business. Sometimes they don't have the equity to complete at the price that you want. So what you're saying is to them is, I will lend you the extra money, whether it's 10, 20 or 30%. You will repay it to me over time. I will charge you interest. Here is the official document that you sign, which is exactly what you sign with the bank. And I'm in the best scenarios, you've got personal guarantees and you've got a lien over their property if they don't pay you when you're meant to be paid. It's as simple as that. And the other structure that I find is common in releasing additional value is a staged earnout. Now, a staged earnout, very common with financial buyers like private equity firms. You might sell 30%. And there might be an exit, a put and a pull clause in your shareholders agreement after 3 to 5 years. So that gives a buyer comfort, de-risks the deal for them, because you're going to be continuing to have involvement and a vested interest in the business to some degree. But I've seen these structures in all different forms. I've seen them at, they're buying in at 30% or 50% or 70%. They're buying 20% now, and after certain operational things happen, you've removed you from the business, it triggers a put clause where they then buy the other 80% at a certain valuation. Deals can be structured many different ways.
Yeah, and the other one I think we haven't touched on as well too, which across all industries is becoming probably more common, is like a management buyout type structure as well, where the people that know the business as well as the owner, generally the next line of senior management, be it one on their own or as a collective, can cobble together some of their own capital, pair that with a loan from a bank and maybe some vendor finance, and buy it off the owner.
And that's not an uncommon thing in the small to medium companies where staff are there and they've been part of that business for many years. The owner will support the staff in a staff buyout. And that actually works well because those employees have been part of their business for a number of years. They've got an understanding with the clients. They understand the business. They understand the challenges within that industry sector, which is the security industry. And so that's an area that is worthwhile of seeing if it's a possibility in that early stages of, I want to sell my business, but who are the buyers? And the buyers may be at your front door.
Yeah, one of the challenges with that process, though, is that first of all, you've got to tell them that you're planning on selling, so that flags automatically. They think, oh, hang on. So if you sell to someone else, what's going to happen to me? And then if they're not successful in putting the best deal on the table, or a deal that the seller's happy to do, they feel potentially aggrieved.
Mate, there's many challenges.
And then you've lost them.
I was going to say, you also run the risk, though, that they're going to go out and start surely approaching some of your existing customers with whom they have relationships anyway. Isn't that a danger?
Oh, look, I have to say I've been involved in a number of these. I'm involved in one now. It's fraught with danger, and if I may elaborate for a moment, first of all, you've got a relationship with these guys, and as you said, Mike, if they can feel aggrieved if they're not almost given the business. And so what I've found is that it's best to do it in a competitive environment. The business is on the market. We have buyers. You have the opportunity to do it. It's short and sharp. It's being done by a third party so that there's no damage to the relationship. Someone else is managing it, because it can really destroy relationships. And what I've seen in my 20 years is that they don't like to go and get finance for it, right? They don't want to put their house on the line. And if you essentially give them the vendor finance, quite often it's like a kid with a bike. He's given the bike and he leaves it out in the rain. And if you don't give it to them at the price they want, then there can be issues. So when I've been helicoptered into these, I like to run it on an open plane with other buyers involved, and they're given the opportunity, and it's short and sharp, but it can often create more
you're quite
challenges.
right. There's a lot of trust there. Yeah. And it can be burnt very easily, but it is an option, and they may want to consider it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm mindful of the fact that we're sort of coming to the end of our allotted time. Was there anything else that we felt you wanted to cover or needed to cover before we start to land the plane, so it were?
I think just going back to the process, I suppose Mark talked about doing the valuation process, and then preparing an information memorandum type sales document. So that process in itself involves the collection of all this information from the seller around their business, which can be quite time consuming and arduous. So I think a seller mindset needs to be established at that point in time, I think. So people need to be conditioned to understand that the actual owner, potentially people in their leadership team in the finance and commercial areas, are going to be required to sort of come into the inner sanctum inside the tent to gather information, because at that point in time you probably don't want everyone knowing that you're thinking of selling the business. So there's a sort of a process where you set the rules of engagement in terms of how we're all going to operate, in terms of gathering information, who's going to be responsible, where's it going to be housed. I often tell people, let's set up a shared data room or a Dropbox folder structure where they can just populate information into. In fact, I often tell people to do that anyway, even when they're not getting ready to sell, as a state of readiness approach. Yep. And so we can establish a folder structure which is sort of self-explanatory to hold their hand, so they know, I can see there's all these folders here with employee documents and financials and tax returns and things, so that they just go in and self-populate all this information, and then essentially get this information memorandum prepared. And then usually at the same time you're doing essentially a market scan, looking for buyers and starting to populate a buyer profile list, which I generally do A lists and B lists. So A lists are the ones with money that can transact, and the Bs are not that. And ultimately, you aim to transact with someone on the A list, but it doesn't always go that way, and sometimes you've got to go to the B list. And often, I think as we touched on before, that when you share the list with the seller, to say that, well, these are the people we've identified that we think, based on these reasons, should be the people we go and talk to. Do you have any issues with anyone on this list? And sometimes they'll go, I'll never sell to that.
Yeah, I don't care how much he pays us.
So you knock them out and go, okay, fine.
But look, that's where the rubber hits the road. I mean, there's a lot of people in big firms, in big accounting firms, and in small boutique operators that really don't get the rubber sticking to the road at that point. And going out to identifying the target list, prioritizing it, having a structured approach, and really beating down their doors to make sure that you got in front of as many buyers as possible. Because if you think about it this way, if you've got one buyer, they've got the balance of power. As soon as you put 5 buyers in there, you've got the balance of power. So it's our job as, having a fiduciary responsibility to the client to bring as many buyers to the table as possible. And that means looking under rocks. That means, knocking down their doors and getting in front of them with the opportunity without exposing the name. You want to do it on a confidential basis. I've got a business, it's turning over 20, it's netting 4, and my research and analysis indicates it's a great strategic fit for you. And doing that 6 or 7 times, 4 or 5 different ways until you get through to the decision maker. And it helps, obviously, if you've transacted in the industry before and you know who those buyers are. But getting as many buyers to the table as possible, because sometimes you might think they're a B player, but you don't know that they've got money behind them. Yeah, right. You don't know that a PE firm's just bought into them, and there's billions of dollars there. And so it's really about knocking on those doors and getting in front of those people and getting them to the table, creating that competitive tension, and getting the best possible deal for the client. And that deal, that could be on price, it could be on structure, it could be on terms, it could be any of those things that you've got to go back and massage out to get the best deal.
Price isn't always everything.
Yep. Okay, so just to recap, am I correct in assuming, number 1, don't wait to sell until you have to sell? Where possible, always start forward thinking well in advance. Do I want to sell my business? How am I going to value the business? Possibly even as part of your succession planning, get someone to come in and have a look at the structure who might help with that sales process, so they can say to you well in advance, well, you need to sort this out, you need to sort this, and this before you can actually start looking at selling the business. And then have an idea of who you're going to sell to, what your target audience might be, and your prospective target clients might be. And then once you understand all of that, get in place the right people to actually help you go through and put the sales structure in place.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
Yep. And if people want to know more about you, Mike, how do they find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn if you want to. Yep. Look for Michael Johns, look for Aquila Corporate Advisory.
Yep. And Mark, yourself?
Mark Jason, Link Business. I'm on LinkedIn and pretty much everywhere else. I think you can Google me.
And Peter, people find you through ASIAL how?
Just through ASIAL. They just come through to ASIAL and they'll always find me. And really it comes down to some of those areas is trying to find those buyers, and that means you've got to seek advice. If you don't seek advice, you're not doing justice to yourself or your business. So when you get that advice, then you've got to follow it, and that's the important thing we have.
If you want to take a deeper dive, there's an article on all of this. It's in the latest issue of Security Insider, so you can find that in the magazine, or you can go to www.asial.com to find out more there. You'll also find more podcasts like this one on iTunes, Blueberry, Spotify, Google Play, and all the great places that you can find podcasts. We look forward to speaking to you again next time, and stay safe. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Take care.